Thank you very much for what I'm sure was a kind introduction, though I don't speak your language. It's a pleasure to be in The Hague. I'm coming here from Geneva, and the things we do in Geneva we sometimes send to The Hague. So it's good to be here and try to follow up on the things that are being sent here. I was asked to speak about the United Nations and its treatment of the Israeli-Arab conflict. And I'd like to begin by sharing a few words about today's centenary. The season that we're in now, starting from August through the end of this month, marks 3 significant anniversaries for Israel and the Jewish people. The Balfour Declaration is but one of these 3, so I want to frame today's anniversary in the context of one that came before and one that will come shortly afterward. 120 years ago, in August 1897, in Switzerland, Theodor Herzl convened the first Zionist Congress in Basel. For the first time in 2 millennia, the Jewish people were gathered in plenary assembly, returned as a political entity on the world stage. In the Basel program, the Congress declared its goal, quote, Zionism seeks to establish a home for the Jewish people in Palestine, secured under public law. When the conference ended, Herzl confided in his diary, quote, at Basel I founded the Jewish state. If I said this out loud today, I would be answered by universal laughter. Perhaps in 5 years, certainly in 50, everyone will know it. Today we mark the second milestone, 100 years since the Balfour Declaration. On November 2nd, 1917, the British government, with the approval of the Allied powers in Washington, Paris, and Rome, declared its support for the establishment in Palestine of, quote, a national home for the Jewish people. Indeed, a mere 20 years after the Basel program, the international community had granted its first public recognition of the existence of the Jewish people and of its right to a homeland in the land of Israel. As the historian Martin Kramer noted, the Balfour Declaration was much more than the statement of one government. Now, as you may know, in the past year, Palestinian President Mahmoud Abbas and his government have been saying that they will sue the British government. I haven't seen the lawsuit yet, but this has been part of the rhetoric for the past year in statements made at the United Nations, in articles written in the New York Times and elsewhere. And every few months, we're going to sue the British for the Balfour Declaration. And that's, I think, an important point of rhetoric for Mahmoud Abbas, as it has been for the PLO for some years, and the notion that the reestablishment of Jewish peoplehood in the land of Israel is an act of British imperialism. It kind of fits in a simplistic conspiracy theory where the acts of the Zionists, you know, lifting the rocks and draining the malaria swamps and creating kibbutzim and all of the hard work that the pioneers did doesn't exist. And all of the work that was done by Jewish people around the world raising money to support their efforts, none of this exists. It was just a decision by the British, the big imperialists. They came, they stole our land, and that's why we have trouble today. It's nothing that we've done, it's nothing that we haven't done, it's nothing that the Jewish people did. It's because of an imperialist design. And so I think it's interesting, the point that Martin Kramer makes was that actually the Balfour Declaration, at the middle of the First World War, when the British were acting in close concert with their allies, was very much the statement of one very much more than the statement of one government. It was, in 1917, the rough equivalent of what today would be a UN Security Council decision. It was an act endorsed by the great powers of the day. Britain acted necessarily with the support of its allies, the United States, France, Italy, and with the endorsement of the Vatican, which controlled many Christian holy sites. Quote, God has willed it, Pope Benedict XV told the Zionist leader Nachum Sokolov. This international recognition from 1917 was 5 years later engraved in formal international law when it was expanded and enshrined by the League of Nations in its 1922 mandate for Palestine, which granted recognition to, quote, the historical connection of the Jewish people with Palestine and to the grounds for reconstituting their national home in that country. So, ladies and gentlemen, when we mark the Balfour Declaration today, we mark 100 years since the world recognized the historic rights of the Jewish people as an indigenous people to the land of Israel. Of course, later this month we will mark the third anniversary, 70 years since the decision of 29 November 1947, Resolution 181, the Partition Plan, when the General Assembly voted to support a Jewish state. Indeed, just as Herzl predicted, 50 years after the first Zionist Congress in Basel, and also to support an Arab state following the British termination of its mandate. Jews in Palestine and around the world danced that night and accepted partition of the Holy Land. The second time they accepted partition, 1937 Peel Plan being the first, which was rejected by the Arabs. And once again in 1947, the Arab states rejected the partition, and as they would go on to reject successive offers of an Arab state in Palestine up until 2008. And at the time they declared war, and we know what happened during that war. Now, despite this international recognition in 1917, in 1922, in 1947, of the rights of the Jewish people to the historic land of Israel, why does it seem that this right is implicitly or even explicitly all too often called into question? And that's what I want to speak about very briefly, is my experience as an observer at the United Nations, watching how the issue of the Israeli-Arab conflict is treated across the UN system. And I'm just going to turn a spotlight on a number of key UN agencies and examine how the Israel-Arab conflict is treated. The General Assembly is meeting now in its main legislative session in New York. And UN Watch now has a New York office, so my colleague just wrote to me today to give me the update on the resolutions that are being planned, and I will share with you what is on the agenda for the next few weeks. The General Assembly meets first in committee. 193 countries vote on a resolution, and then it gets voted again by the same countries acting as the plenary a few weeks later in late November, early December. So this is what's on the General Assembly agenda for the next month, the next 6 weeks, their main legislative agenda of the year. There is one resolution on Syria, where some 500,000 people have been killed, millions wounded, exiled, displaced, starved. One resolution on human rights in Iran, one resolution on North Korea, one resolution on Crimea, and one on Myanmar. And then there are 20 on Israel. I don't have 4 hands, but imagine 4 hands over here. So there's 5 on the entire world, 193 countries, only 5 are singled out, 1 each, 1 on Syria, 1 on North Korea, 1 on Iran, and 20 on Israel. I mean, that is astonishing. I am verbeistert. I know that because NOS, is that how you pronounce it? NOS? NOS, yeah, has been quoting some of our reactions when Saudi Arabia keeps getting elected to the Human Rights Council. So I see on NOS, UN Watch is verbeistert. So I keep getting verbeistert. So that's my reaction now. 20 resolutions on Israel. Now, if there were to be one on Israel, I think we could have a dispute whether Israeli actions in the territories arise to the level of Iran, North Korea, Syria. And I think we could have a very serious discussion whether Israel ought to be treated, one resolution on Syria and one resolution on Israel. And resolutions that, by the way, make no mention of Hamas. The word doesn't appear there anywhere. The stabbings, the shootings, the vehicular attacks. I know when there was the attack in New York recently, you saw in your newspapers the list of attacks that have been happening across Europe in Nice and Barcelona and London and other places across Europe and Stockholm. And most likely, I didn't read your newspapers, but most likely they didn't mention Jerusalem and other cities in Israel where there have been many, many such attacks, vehicular attacks. So all of these terrorist attacks that have been hitting Israelis in the past couple of years, especially in Jerusalem, are not mentioned at all in these resolutions. The resolutions only condemn Israel. And even if there are positive actions, they don't mention them. It's not just the number, it's the quality and the content of what is in those resolutions. Israel is stigmatized as evil. That is the effect. 20 resolutions on Israel. And I'm very sad to inform you that your government, together with other European Union states, supports 15 out of the 20. So in each given year, in recent years, and I expect no different this year, unfortunately, unless there'll be a change, 20 resolutions, the Netherlands and other countries will support 15 of them and abstain on the other 5. And the countries that introduce these resolutions, the Palestinian, the State of Palestine, as it's called at the UN, with the Arab League and the Islamic states, they see the message. When the EU votes yes or abstains, that's a message, it's a green light, continue. And the cumulative effect, even if the content in many of these resolutions, a given EU country could say, well, we condemn settlements, and we condemn these actions, and we condemn the occupation of the Golan Heights, or what have you. There is no other situation that I'm aware of where the EU would allow 20 resolutions on a situation. If someone were to introduce 20 resolutions on Crimea, 20 resolutions on Iran, the reaction of any country would be, are you crazy? Do you know how much work each resolution is? This is just absurd. But somehow the resolutions on condemning Israel are just tolerated, and it's wrong. And it harms the credibility of the UN. And I'll just briefly give a few agencies how this works, and then come to the one that I'm most familiar with, the Human Rights Council, which is across the street from my office, where I've been for the past 13 years. Yes, I'm celebrating my bar mitzvah at the Human Rights Council. The Commission on the Status of Women is the UN agency that is mandated to strengthen gender equality and the empowerment of women. They only adopt one resolution a year that criticizes a country, Israel, the Jewish state. No other country is condemned. There's no resolution, for example, in Saudi Arabia, which has a male guardianship system, where women need permission for so many important things, including to leave the country. To get out of prison, you need a male guardian approval, a great many things. And there's no resolution on Saudi Arabia. On the contrary, as you heard, and that's why I was in NOS, is that earlier this year in April, the United Nations Economic and Social Council voted to elect Saudi Arabia to the Women's Rights Commission, to the CSW. 47 out of 54 countries voted to elect Saudi Arabia. There was no other candidate, but you could leave it blank, or you could write Saudi Arabia. 47 countries, including at least 5 EU countries, probably more, voted for Saudi Arabia to be on this Women's Rights Commission, which is outrageous and unacceptable. And when we revealed that Sweden, Norway, Ireland, Belgium were among the countries that voted, there were scandals in each of these countries. The Irish members of parliament demanded to know how their government voted. The foreign minister said it's a secret ballot. We don't want to say how we voted. The ministers in the coalition demanded that it be revealed. We need to know how our government voted. They wouldn't say. The same in Norway. In Sweden, the foreign minister wouldn't say. She said it's not important, it doesn't matter. Then she said, Margot Wallström, she said, well, actually, it's good that those countries, precisely like Saudi Arabia, it's good that they're elected to the Women's Rights Commission, because that's where they can learn about women's rights. Right? This is a quote. The video is on YouTube. Go on YouTube, type in Margot Wallström Saudi election, and you can watch her saying that's where they can learn about women's rights. I don't know if in Sweden, I was there recently in Stockholm, and I asked whether they take serial rapists and murderers and put them on the Supreme Court, because that's where they can learn about justice and crime and so forth. But that was her comment. And of course in Belgium, the government wouldn't say. It was a big scandal for a week. The foreign minister was being challenged repeatedly. He wouldn't say how they voted. He said, well, sometimes you need to bring countries in to have a big tent and so forth, which is, by the way, is a great lie. Many people in Geneva, the insiders of the system, will tell you, yeah, we need to bring in these regimes because that's how we pull them in, and we can influence them. And I ask, can any expert anyone, tell me how in the past 10 years, when Russia has been almost always a member of the Human Rights Council, they're not on now, but they were most of the years, Vladimir Putin being brought on the Human Rights Council, has it improved his human rights record as he marched into Crimea and as he poisoned Vladimir Kara-Murza, who we're going to bring to our annual Human Rights Conference, the Geneva Summit for Human Rights on February 20th, 2018, and you're all invited, where we will be bringing the true champions of human rights. Has Russia been improved? Has Saudi Arabia been improved by bringing them in as they bomb 10,000 civilians in Yemen? Has China been improved as Liu Xiaobo is just left to die in prison? And Venezuela been improved as the Maduro, after Chavez regime, is being re-elected to the Human Rights Council, as they beat, starve, and jail their own people? Have they been improved? This notion that we bring in the worst regimes to improve them is complete nonsense, and everybody inside the system knows it. It doesn't mean that a country that is beginning to try and mend their ways can't be pulled in somehow, but that bringing in the worst regimes is absolutely absurd. But that's what was said. And of course, in Belgium, finally, after all the pressure, the Prime Minister, Charles Michel, appeared before the Parliament, and he admitted, yes, we, Belgium, we voted for Saudi Arabia to be on the Women's Rights Commission, and he said, je regrette, I apologize. And si c'était à refaire, if we could redo it, we would do it differently. By the way, it was leaked in the Belgian media that not only did Belgium tell their ambassador in New York to vote for the Saudis, they said, make sure you tell the Saudis that we voted for them. Make sure they know that we voted for them. So that's unfortunately how this works. Well, coming back to our issue, Israel is the only country condemned annually each year at the Women's Rights Commission. In Geneva, we have the World Health Organization. They meet each year at the World Health Assembly. And only one country gets condemned, that's Israel. They mention things in the Palestinian territories and the Golan Heights. Syria is not condemned, but Israel is condemned for its actions in the Golan Heights, even as thousands of Syrians flee Syria, wounded, to come to Israel to get medical treatment. And this is something that John Kerry mentioned when he was in Geneva 2 years ago. Then, of course, there's UNESCO, which has been a lot in the news. Despite the Balfour Declaration, despite the League of Nations mandate, and the 1947 vote for a Jewish state, UNESCO repeatedly calls into question Israel's historical rights at the holiest sites of Judaism, in Jerusalem, at the Temple Mount, at its Western Wall, where it adopts resolutions that will typically use Islamic-only names. So the Temple Mount is known as Haram al-Sharif, and you have countries like France voting for it, even though in its great museums you have paintings of Jesus in the temple upending the money changers, the carts. And, but they're voting for resolutions that suggest that there was no temple, and there's a bit of a disconnect. Of course, recently the resolution on Hebron, which also suggested that this is a Palestinian site, an Arab site, which is, of course, the tomb of the patriarchs, the burial place of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, Sarah, Rebecca, and Leah. When in May, UNESCO adopted again another resolution singling out Israel for censure. I'm happy to say that no European country, no EU country other than Sweden voted for it. So we're seeing some EU states, if I'm not mistaken, I believe the Netherlands voted against some of these UNESCO resolutions recently, and I salute them for that. Because those who truly care about the United Nations must speak out. For who is the true friend of the world body? Those who do deals like the Belgians tried to do that enable dictators to hijack the organization and pervert its founding principles, or those who speak out and resist? I'll mention finally one other body, the one that I'm familiar with, which is the Human Rights Council. The Human Rights Council was created in 2006 in June. I was there. Kofi Annan, the year before, had declared in February 2005 that the old Commission on Human Rights, created by Eleanor Roosevelt and René Cassin in 1946, after the war to reaffirm the principle of human dignity, that 60 years later this body had failed. As you know, 1946, founding chair Eleanor Roosevelt, 2003, the representative of Colonel Muammar Gaddafi. From Eleanor Roosevelt to Gaddafi, the rise and fall of human rights at the United Nations. The Gaddafi regime, after they tortured the Palestinian doctor and the 5 Bulgarian nurses in that famous case, had a connection here because the Palestinian doctor received asylum here in the Netherlands, and I worked with one of your Dutch lawyers to get justice for him, which we did get at another international body, the 18-member Human Rights Committee, which ruled in his favor. But you know, the Human Rights Commission made Gaddafi their chair, his ambassador in Geneva, And then Kofi Annan, 2 years later, said, it's not working, we need a new body. And he talked about the selectivity and the politicization. We said we need to change it. They created the Human Rights Council, new and improved body, June 2006. How has the Human Rights Council acted? What is its record now 11 years later? Well, in the first 10 years of the Council, they've adopted 135 resolutions that condemn specific countries, 67 of them on the whole world combined, 68 on Israel. So there have been more resolutions on Israel at the Human Rights Council than on the rest of the world combined. There's been about maybe 15 on Syria, maybe 7 on Iran, 68 on Israel. So much for the reform. As you know, before the Human Rights Council meets, we're going to meet in March. Foreign ministers will gather in Geneva, and on the agenda will be the same agenda, 10 items. There'll be agenda item 4, which is human rights situations that require the Council's attention. That's where you can put a focus, in theory, on any country situation around the world, 193 countries. Agenda item 4 for one day. And then the next week, we'll have agenda item 7, which is human rights violations in Palestine and other occupied Arab territories. So one agenda item on the world and one agenda item on Israel alone. Again, no other country in the world has its own agenda item, not North Korea, not Iran, not Syria, not Sudan. All of them, if they are addressed, and sometimes they are, it is under agenda item 4. Only Israel has its own item. Some have tried to excuse this absurdity. Navi Pillay, the former High Commissioner, said, but you know, it's only there because of occupation. That's why it's there. The moment there won't be any occupation, it will be removed. Of course, for her, occupation means that includes East Jerusalem. It means it includes the Western Wall. It includes the Jewish quarter. So as long as there are any Israelis living in, and Israel has any presence in the Jewish quarter in Jerusalem, that's occupation. She says, but that's the only reason. Of course, you can pick dozens of examples of occupation around the world, and there's no agenda item. There's no agenda item on Crimea, on Russia and Crimea. There's no agenda item on Morocco and Western Sahara. There's no agenda item on Turkey and Northern Cyprus, Nagorno-Karabakh, and you can go on and on and on the list. So that has nothing to do with it. Michael Link, who's the UN rapporteur for Palestine, he recently said the same idea, that it's because of occupation. Well, those who want to single out Israel will always find a way, and that's how it happens at the Human Rights Council. As I mentioned, there have been 68 resolutions on Israel from 2006 to 2016, so I'm not counting in the past year. At the same time, there have been 0 resolutions on Turkey, even after Erdogan fired 100,000 teachers, judges, academics, and other officials, forced independent journalists like Can Dündar and Yavuz Baydar into exile. They recently spoke at our Geneva Summit for Human Rights. We'll have another distinguished Turkish champion speaking for us on February 20th. 0 resolutions for victims in Venezuela, where the dictator Maduro, as I said, starves, beats, tortures, and jails his own people through the entire opposition. Leopoldo Lopez, Antonio Ledesma in prison under house arrest. 0 resolutions on China, where 1/5 of the world's population is denied basic human rights. And 0 resolutions on human rights in Saudi Arabia, even as it subjugates women, tramples religious freedom, and conducts beheadings. To the Netherlands' credit, there is now a resolution recently that focuses on Yemen. It doesn't mention Saudi Arabia. It puts in some members on a commission of inquiry that have to be from the region, but for the first time there's a bit of a spotlight on Yemen, and that is a good thing, and I congratulate the Netherlands for their principled and diligent actions in this regard. But if you come to the Human Rights Council, the countries I just mentioned, on the contrary, the worst criminals are themselves the judges. The council members today include such champions of freedom as China, Cuba, Qatar, Saudi Arabia, and Venezuela. Soon, in 2 months, they will be joined by Afghanistan, Angola, and the Democratic Republic of Congo, which I assure you is not so democratic. Just yesterday, they announced that the elections that they've been delaying already, so Kabila could hold on to power. It's a country that has child soldiers, that uses rape as a weapon of war, has delayed elections once again, and another power grab. Pakistan, where acid attacks on women happen regularly, where Asia Bibi, Christian mother of 5, is on death row for blasphemy. Pakistan will be joining also in January. So this is at the Human Rights Council. Again, I want to mention the issue is not only an agenda item, it's not only the fact that more than 50% of the resolutions are in Israel, it is the content of the resolutions. These resolutions say not a word of Hamas, not only of what Hamas does to Israelis with terrorist attacks, whether it's rockets fired, stabbings, shootings, car attacks, killing little children in their homes, as happens in a number of recent attacks, but the treatment of Palestinian entities to their own people. When Michael Link, the Special Rapporteur for Palestine, appeared recently, about 10 days ago in New York, and we sent him a letter and 3 journalists asked him, why is it that in your mandate you refuse to say a word about how Hamas treats their own people, gays, women, minorities, basic citizens who want to speak out, who are beaten, jailed, tortured. And he said, well, I'm not allowed to, it's not in my mandate. They said, well, you know, it's true. The mandate he was given from February 1993 by the old Human Rights Commission, when Israel was the only power, meaning before the Oslo Agreement, before the PA and then Hamas took over Gaza, before the PA took over control of Ramallah and a good part of the cities in the West Bank. That mandate dates from before there was any of this, so it only mentions Israel. But today you would think if you care about Palestinians, you would also care if a Palestinian is tortured by Hamas, which if he's going to be tortured by anyone in Gaza, it's going to be by Hamas. It's not in his mandate. He says, I can't speak about it. Well, some of his predecessors, even John Dugard, who people will know here, he teaches in this country, he's a very harsh critic of Israel. Even John Dugard, in one of his reports, said, I'm not supposed to, but I'm obliged to morally speak out about the death penalty in Gaza. So he did. And Hanu Halinin, another predecessor, he too spoke out about torture in Palestinian areas, but Michael Link says, I'm not allowed to. He is the special rapporteur of the Human Rights Council. And so it's important that what's in the content of the resolutions. And it's very interesting, one final point about the content, is that most other countries, when a country is criticized at the Human Rights Council, for example, Sudan, a country whose leader is wanted here in this city for genocide, when the Human Rights Council adopts a resolution on Sudan, and when they have some critical language about the fact that he's wanted for genocide or what have you, they will almost always use diplomatic protocol and commend and praise the country concerned. So for example, in 2008, the resolution on Sudan that had some criticism, even as it expressed concern at Darfur, it failed to openly condemn the Sudan government, and it praised the regime, and I'm going to quote, for its, quote, collaboration, for its, quote, engagement, for measures taken to address the human rights situation, for cooperating fully with the Special Rapporteur, for its progressive realization of economic, social, and cultural rights in Sudan. And the list goes on. And that is a common thing. Even in resolutions critical of Myanmar, Sudan, or other countries, there will be some words with some legitimate basis or not commending the country. And diplomats will tell you, that's the way it works. We want to acknowledge, we want to encourage certain things. Now, if you take the case of Israel, you'll have some international bodies like the Quartet or the European Union, which will acknowledge developments that even if they sharply criticize Israel, will acknowledge measures that Israel has taken to improve the lot of Palestinians in various areas, whether it's removing checkpoints, whether it's allowing in millions of tons of goods going over the border into Gaza on a regular basis, or whether it's allowing in cooperating with UN rapporteurs like the Special Rapporteur on Violence Against Women, who was invited to Israel, Navi Pillay, who was invited to Israel, etc. And yet, when it comes to Israel, unlike all the other countries, virtually all the other countries, there are some where this happens, but in case in Israel, there is never one positive word. No matter what Israel has done, no matter which UN expert it's cooperated with, there is not one positive word in there, because I believe that the goal is actually not to improve the lot of Palestinians on the ground. That is not the first thought of those who sponsor the resolutions, and even perhaps of those who support many of them. But there seems to be a campaign to stigmatize the state of Israel, to demonize the state of Israel. And as Bernard Harrison has written in his book, The Resurgence of Anti-Semitism, the practice of singling out Israel, I believe, not only with a disproportionate amount of resolutions, but with language that is uniquely condemnatory, it constantly reinforces the impression that there is nothing whatsoever to be said in Israel's favor. Nothing. There's nothing positive that could be said. And the effect is to stigmatize Israel as evil. Something that is evil, there is nothing positive that you can say about something that is evil. If you were talking about the Nazis, you would never say anything positive. And sadly, at the Human Rights Council, what I've witnessed is when Israel is treated, forget about the fact that Hamas is ignored. The word never appears. The PA never appears. The torture of journalists never appears in these resolutions. But whenever Israel is mentioned, it's the strongest condemnatory language and not one word, unlike other resolutions, unlike the norm, where there's some acknowledgement, some praise. This never appears. Now, all of this is, needless to say, is in violation of the United Nations Charter, which guarantees equal treatment of all nations, large and small. Israel should be held to account. It is not only the right of the United Nations, but the obligation of the United Nations to hold every country to account for its human rights record, but it has to do so in a manner that is constructive and that is equal. And sadly, what we've seen is that this is not the case. And so when diplomats or UN experts tell me that they're angry that Israel has not cooperated with a UN mechanism such as a special rapporteur, I ask, how do you expect the Israeli people to, if you want to influence them, if you come with such a record, if you come with unclean hands, with such an extreme, disproportionate record, no one will take you credibly. So if the United Nations wants to be a credible player on the ground, and there are many United Nations actors who are serious and who do not belong to the bodies that I mentioned, and who do want to make a difference on the ground, and who do want to be a fair broker, in order to be effective and credible, they have to work at changing the record of these UN bodies. It's in violation of the UN Charter. It's a violation of the Human Rights Council's Charter when it was created in June 2006, which promised to put an end to selectivity and politicization and to act in a fair manner. And of course, Antonio Guterres has said this year repeatedly that Israel is a United Nations member state like every other, and it should be treated no differently. So to conclude, the United Nations, if we look 100 years after the Balfour Declaration, where the rights of the Jewish people to the land of Israel were acknowledged, endorsed by the international community, enshrined in international law at the League of Nations mandate, too often at a great many UN bodies, not all, but a great many, we see this recognition, I would say, implicitly or explicitly questioned, undermined. It does not help the peace process. It does not help Israelis and Palestinians on the ground. If anything, it only pulls them farther apart, and it does not help the good work of the United Nations. Thank you very much.